Meanwhile, on the battlefield, it seems the Russians are making steady progress in Kursk, having again absolutely hammered Ukraine's infrastructure with more missile attacks. Now, is that because the Americans paused the sharing of intelligence that Ukraine depends upon? Earlier today, President Trump suggested the U.S. had just about lifted that suspension, though quite what just about means is still unclear. Let's hear now from Robert Wilkie. He was Veterans Secretary in the first Trump administration and Undersecretary of State for Defense before that. Does he think that Trump's comment about lifting the suspension means we're back to business as usual?
I do think that, and I'm also hopeful because I very much want to do everything that we can to protect Ukraine's sovereignty, that the flow of weapons will begin shortly. But I do think after this little pause and the forcing both sides to come to the table, it's actually not so much a Trump pattern, but it's a pattern that's played out throughout American history. Dwight Eisenhower forcing the Koreans under Sigmund Rhee to the table, Richard Nixon forcing Golda Meir to actually feed the Egyptian Third Army before there was a ceasefire in the War of Atonement, and then Nixon again making noises and putting pressure on President Tu of South Vietnam to come to the table. So this is something that American presidents have been doing in the post-World War II era.
That is really, really interesting, because that suggests you see this, as it were, as a jolt, a moment to sort of force a change in the dynamics rather than any big strategic shift of direction.
Absolutely. And I think it has served its purpose. And the one strategic mistake that Mr. Putin has made, which actually accelerated the comments that the president made on Air Force One yesterday, was another brazen attack on civilians and civilian infrastructure. I think that awakened some in the White House, and it's the United States that holds all the tools here, both economic and military. The last thing Vladimir Putin wants to do is to return to the first Trump administration, when his economy was broken by sanctions and low price for oil. He pegged his economy to $100 a barrel. When Trump finally unleashes the energy power of the United States, we're going to see oil come back down again. And Putin will also know that Trump can turn off the spigots to his banks and isolate him in that regard.
And do you think that's what Trump was referring to when he had a sort of slightly vague comment about the stuff that keeps pressure on Putin that I know about and I haven't talked about yet, but he knows as well? Is that what he's talking about?
He is, and you know, most people don't remember, and I was in the Pentagon at the time, that when Putin got too close to American troops in the Syrian desert and refused a request to pull back, Trump ordered a massive attack on Russian forces in Syria and killed 300 of Putin's men. So Trump is on record, not with Russian collusion, but actually bringing Putin to heel to the extent which he did not move on Ukraine during the first Trump administration.
I'd like to come back to that in just a second, but just before we leave the issue of intelligence, do you think there has been unease or concern in America about the devastating impact of removing that intelligence from Ukraine, which did seem to make it much easier for Putin's forces to hammer infrastructure in particular, but also civilian areas?
Well, I think the more prescient or more prevailing notion in America was the stoppage of arms in transit through Poland. I don't know that many Americans had a grasp on the value of battlefield intelligence, but they certainly can understand the kinetic power that was being stopped at the Polish border before entering Ukraine. Now, as someone who's spent a lifetime in the military, I know a week's loss of intelligence on a stagnant battlefield, as the battlefield is now for the most part, except what we're seeing in Kursk, is not going to change the balance of power. If it goes on much longer, then maybe Britain and France could fill in the gap, but that's not clear either.
So I guess a more general question. We've seen there's obviously been problems in the relationship between Zelensky and Trump. But in terms of America more generally, is your sense that your country is still rooting for Ukraine?
Well, I think so. I mean, the natural American tendency has always been to root for the underdog, be it on the sports field or in international relations. That's been part of our DNA for almost 250 years now. And I hope that is the case. That is still the case.
Well, that is very good to hear. Turning to the Riyadh negotiations just getting underway, we really haven't heard anything much from Russia yet about whether they really want to end the conflict, and if so, how they would start to do it. What do you think we need to hear from them? Is it around this idea of an air and sea pause before anything else?
Well, I think so. I mean, any time, and certainly Britain, through its long history, has been through these moments. The most famous, of course, being in the adjustment of lines near the end of the Great War and World War II, that those things happen prior to a ceasefire, prior to the signing of a formal agreement. But the messages Trump has sent, again, is to remind the Russians that they don't have many levers that they can pull. And I think Trump is never given credit for understanding the different elements of American power that can be unleashed. In this case, it's economic, it's energy, and it's also military.
Well, the whole world is watching and waiting. Mr. Wilkie, thank you very much indeed for talking to me.